Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I get to talk to Greg Nuckols. Greg has been putting in a lot of work into a recent article that surrounds all of the information and scientific literature coming out on the impact of training volume on muscle hypertrophy. So, how much do we really need to do in the gym to grow at our best? How much do we need to do to grow well? How much do we need to do to grow at all? And we're talking about weekly hard sets in general. But within this chat with Greg, we define volume. We talk about why he even wanted to make this article in the first place. And I did not avoid the hard questions. There's been lots of critiques placed upon this body of literature and those who have been interpreting it a certain way where maybe there's more volume and more growth. And so I put across some of those counter arguments and we dive into all of that and much more. This was a fantastic chat with Greg. He does a great job of getting you to understand exactly where he's coming from and where there are some pseudo scientific arguments coming from and why they are completely flawed. And he basically just makes that really simple and easy to understand. So if you've ever been confused about how much volume to do for muscle growth, we dive into all of that. We also cover some of the practical take-homes. So guys, you will love this chat.
This podcast is brought to you by MacroFactor, the smartest nutrition app on the market. Think of it like MyFitnessPal, but supercharged. It outperforms it in every single way. You just enter your details and goals, log your food, and wait. From there, MacroFactor fine-tunes your plan automatically, giving your body exactly what it needs to stay on track and reach your goals, without the guesswork. If you find tracking apps to be stressful or feel like they're judging you for not being perfect, then you'll love MacroFactor. No punishment for imperfection. The app will adapt your habits and help you better understand your body to move towards your goals at your own pace. So ditch the outdated apps and get with the times. Download MacroFactor today and use my code STRONGER to get 2 weeks completely free via the App Store or Google Play, or find it linked in the description below. Now with that said, let's get into today's show.
Greg, it is fantastic to have you back on the show. It's been a little while. My first question is, how much did big volume pay you to write your most recent article on volume?
Nothing.
That's you can't say that.
No, it's true. It's true. Yeah, no, I truly don't know why I wrote this article, but I got a bee in my bonnet, and have you seen the movie Forrest Gump?
Oh my gosh, this is an embarrassing moment for me right now, Greg. I have not seen that movie. I think I've seen so many clips, but I don't think I've ever seen the whole thing, which is, I said it to someone the other day and they're like, how have you not seen it? So I haven't seen it, so I apologize.
That's totally fair. That's totally fair. But anyway, there's this scene where he is just running back and forth across America. But the thing that initiates that scene is Forrest just says and I just kept running and just kept running back and forth across America. And that's kind of how I felt with this article. I was like, I have some thoughts about training volume. And so I started writing and I just kept writing. And, yeah, that's, that's how it came to be, I guess.
I know you in the article, you had three big hitters, and it was kind of looking at the impact of volume on hypertrophy and strength, and people kind of get that a bit mixed up. And I thought you did a great job of just debunking that, which we'll dig into. And also just the element of thinking critically about research, which kind of lines up with that really well. It's something you do so eloquently, is how you just explain how we should be using science. And I think it just deciphers so much of what's going on within the social media space. I don't know how much you keep up with that, but science-based lifting is kind of getting a bit of hate right now because I think people aren't necessarily using it right. And I think you talked about that quite a bit in the article. But for the listeners who aren't steeped in the literature on volume, what is training volume? Why does it matter? How are we defining it if we're discussing in this, in your article and also today, in terms of volume first of all, and then low, medium, high, if those terms do come out?
Sure. Yeah. So training volume is most simply just how much training you're doing. There's a lot of ways it can be defined and has been defined over the years. I remember when I first got into lifting, when people talked about training volume, most of the time they would refer to volume load, which was just sets times reps times weight. So, if you were doing a quad workout and you did like, the same number of equally challenging sets of the same number of reps of like knee extensions versus leg press, they'd say like, well, the leg press is higher volume because the weight's heavier, so the volume load's higher. And then a lot of like science-based people would instead be like, oh, no, like we should like there was a time where people just focused on the number of reps in a session based on the classic 2007 Wernbaum meta-analysis, just because that's the metric he used. But these days when people talk about training volume, typically what they're talking about is the number of sets you perform per muscle group, either per session or per week. If the sets are like pretty hard, taken pretty close to failure or to failure. So, for the purpose of discussing training volume, doing like kind of like power work, like doubles or triples with like 70% of 1 RM, usually people wouldn't put too much weight on those sets, but anytime you're training within a few reps of failure, pretty hard set, and just count training volume in terms of sets. So that's typically the metric people have in mind when they talk about training volume. It's important because it influences training outcomes. In a very broad sense, adaptations tend to scale with the magnitude of the stimulus you place upon yourself. And if there's a particular stimulus associated with a particular type of training, like at a given rep range, how close to failure you're training, whatever, you do one set, that's a stimulus. You do another set, that's an additional stimulus. You do another set, it's an additional stimulus. So typically more training volume increases the stressor, increases the stimulus, and as a result, outcomes tend to be larger as well with higher volumes. You led me in with about 5 questions.
I apologize.
I've forgotten the other 3. So
that's all right. I have a tendency to do that. So you answered the kind of important bits there in terms of how we are accounting to volume. Why is it important? I think are fantastic. And actually, I think it was you or someone who wrote, at least on Stronger by Science's blog, who introduced me to hard sets years ago now. I don't know, you might know the date off the top of your head, but that was like quite game-changing, I think, within the industry. And I'm going to use the word game-changing. I know that it gets overused, but I think it really was.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't me. I can't take credit for that, but it was a Stronger by Science article by Nathan Jones from 2015, I believe, which is kind of crazy to think back on because, until that point, I really can't overstate how kind of like hegemonic volume load tended to be as the metric of volume people cared about. And these days everyone talks about it in terms of sets. But that's, I mean, I want to say a relatively new development. That switchover happened like a decade ago at this point. But to me that feels recent because I'm old and I've been doing this for a while. But yeah, that's I personally was not responsible for that, but I'm glad to have been adjacent to that conversation.
For sure. Yeah, it does kind of still feel recent. I do remember the Wernbaum study, which was talked about a lot, and also people would refer to higher volume as like higher reps for that reason as well, because you'd get way higher volume load if you were doing higher reps even with less load. Now with volume, a lot of the literature talks about fractional sets and also kind of weakly fractional sets, so direct sets to the muscle group counting as 1, indirect counting as 0.5. So if we're doing like a pulling motion, that's 1 for the back, but half for a bicep. Like you said, taken close to failure. And within your article, at least, you had low volume at 10 sets or less, middle being 10 to 20, and then high being more than 20. So I think that's a great way to think about it. I think most people would agree with that kind of division of kind of low, medium, and high.
Mhm.
Do you, at this moment, think that set count could be overemphasized as a central variable? And maybe we should also discuss things like how those sets performed. Just interested.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I think that hmm, I think that there is a common thing, at least that annoys me a little bit. And I think something that annoys people who are critical of what they believe to be science-based lifting or whatever, um, is just like an overemphasis on quantification, um, in a way that kind of treats proxies as like ground truth, I guess. And so what I mean by that is like you have a lot of studies on training volume. Like there's a lot of training studies that exist. And like if you want to be able to like analyze and describe all of the research on the topic holistically, um, you basically have two options. You can either kind of go with just a systematic review approach, where instead of like kind of collating everything and statistically analyzing everything together, you can just kind of go through study by study and analyze them thematically and say like, well, volume tended to be higher in this study and here were the results, and volume tended to be lower in this study and here were the results, whatever. Um, and like that was a feasible approach when there were like 5 papers on the topic, but now there's a lot. Like we're pushing 40, and so um, you want to have like common metrics that you can apply to all of those studies to be able to meta-analyze them and just look at it all together. And sets are kind of the best metric we have for doing that. Um, but it doesn't necessarily imply that all sets are created equal. Like if you were to do like even just the like the convention, like you mentioned fractional sets, of like, yeah, if you're doing bicep curls, that counts as a set for biceps. If you're doing rows, that counts as half a set for biceps. Um, there's a lot of different pulling exercises out there, and some of them may be more effective for biceps than others. Like there have been what, 2 or 3 studies comparing bicep curls to pull downs or pull ups, finding that like, looks like pull downs, pull ups are pretty effective for biceps growth. In the studies that exist, they cause about the same amount of biceps growth as curls do. I'm skeptical that that's generalizable. Like, I don't think you're going to build like IFBB pro level biceps only from doing pull downs, but in the populations they've been studied in, seems like those are pretty effective exercises for biceps growth. And then there's like one paper looking at rows and rows effects on biceps growth, and like, rows caused some growth, but like about half as much as curls did. But you you can't necessarily go through and like pick and choose, like it would be unwieldy and oftentimes unjustifiable to assign like precise fractional set values for every single exercise and every single muscle contributing to those exercises. So you just kind of say like, hey, we need a rough heuristic that works, and counting sets for like secondary muscles in a compound exercise is half a set seems to be a rough and dirty heuristic that works pretty well across the board. But, I think some people then look at that and say, well, this implies that all pulling exercises are going to be similarly effective for biceps growth because they're all counted as half a set. Or, all curl variations in this method of quantifying volume would count as one set. Therefore, you're implying that all curling type exercises are, regardless of how they're performed, are similarly effective for biceps growth, which isn't the point and was never the intention. It is just purely, hey, if we're going to look at if we're going to be able to statistically analyze all of this research together, we need some rough heuristics to be able to just like quantify things on a kind of apples to apples basis so we can make these comparisons. But, that doesn't necessarily imply that everything that counts as one set is similarly effective for growing those muscles. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. Just as a personal example, for me, for the longest time, all my pulling, I just felt in my biceps. Like, you could almost count it for a direct set for my biceps and half a set towards my back for how it was going, and my back was so far from failure. So that's obviously evolved over time, and I do think people get a bit too caught up on wanting to track their volume precisely, all these every single set, and I don't know, they do how much is a Meyer rep kind of cluster versus a straight set. And I think they can get a bit lost in wanting that objective number versus what are we actually trying to get hold of. I'm sure there's some sort of good analogy here between kind of people saying calories aren't created equal, but calories are still a useful metric. I'm sure there's some sort of analogy you can use there, similarly to using sets and saying not all sets are created equal. But that immediately came to mind. I think people will kind of understand that from a calorie basis where, getting 50 grams from dextrose versus 50 grams from a variety of fruits. Yeah, there's a difference there for health, if that's kind of the metric we're looking for. But the calorie number is still a useful guideline for people to understand if they're trying to not overeat, for example. So I think that's a very good answer. Again, I think you just made a good case for why hard sets are useful for kind of getting an understanding of assessing things for hypertrophy, but they're not the final answer and were never intended to be. So just want to say you did a good job.
Oh, thanks. And also just I don't know, in general, it's I think more useful for comparing kind of within exercise effects versus between. So, if what's a particularly dumb type of curls? Hercules curls look cool. I don't think they're the best curl exercise out there. I'm sure someone will clip this and someone will make a TikTok and be like, no, Hercules curls are great and this guy's a dumbass, whatever. But I think they're dumb. Just grant me that for the purpose of this discussion. Versus what's hot these days? Are people high on preacher curls, incline curls? What's the curl meta? I don't fucking know. Let's say preacher curls. Preacher curls are good.
Bayesian curl or behind the back cable curl.
Okay.
The preacher curl's also there.
Okay. We'll just say comparing a Bayesian curl to a Hercules curl. I think it's very plausible that on a set-by-set basis, the Bayesian curls are probably more effective. But if you're comparing within exercise, 3 sets of Bayesian curls are probably better than 1. 3 sets of Hercules curls are probably better than 1. So there is that kind of scaling. But then it does, it gets trickier when you then are trying to say yes, but if you're counting each of these as a set for biceps, it's transitive, 3 sets of Bayesian curls are 3 sets for biceps, 3 sets of Hercules curls are 3 sets for biceps. Therefore, you can sub them out and they'll be similarly effective. You can't necessarily always do that, but within exercise, 3 sets of this exercise will probably be more effective than 1 set of this exercise.
Yeah, very well said.
there are some people in the field, Greg, that are skeptical whether or not volume is causative of hypertrophy and whether or not it's just a proxy for other factors like exposure to tension, recruitment, or total work done over time. Do you have thoughts surrounding that?
I do have thoughts. They're very annoying thoughts. I'll admit.
I'm here for annoying thoughts.
So, what does someone mean by causation? Like, so, I don't know. There's kind of a discussion to be had about, like, when people use causal language, how seriously do they mean that, and how just kind of like how persnickety do you want to be when it comes to discussing causation? Because, like, in the strictest sense, causation is essentially just like, B necessarily follows from A, right? So if you wanted to say that volume is causative for hypertrophy, then if you wanted to be very persnickety about it, if it is truly causal, then higher volumes should necessarily always lead to more hypertrophy than lower volumes, which is not the case. But, like, you could apply that to, like, literally anything, where, like, if you want to strip it down to the most basic level, the thing you could say is causal is hypertrophy results when over time net protein accretion exceeds net protein breakdown. Like, yeah, that is like the causal factor for hypertrophy. But then, you go a step back and say, like, okay, what causally increases synthesis, what causally decreases breakdown, and then you get a list of those factors and say, okay, what causally upregulates or downregulates those factors, and, like, you work, and we're exclusively talking about, like, basic, like, molecular shit here. And then by the time you get back to, like, stuff that the organism is doing, nothing is causal. If you want to apply that level of skepticism, like, you couldn't even say that, like, tension is causal for hypertrophy, because, like, I don't know, man. If you're reasonably well trained and you do, like, a maximum isometric for, like, half a second, that is exposing the muscle to, like, a near maximal degree of tension. You could argue that, like, tension could be greater in a maximum overloaded eccentric, but for a maximum isometric, you're going to be generating more tension with the muscle than you ever would during, like, a normal set, which is going to be limited by concentric strength, which is a little lower than isometric strength. But, like, you do a very brief maximum isometric for a muscle group. You're a reasonably well-trained person. That's not going to cause any growth, like, once you get to the level of saying, like, what like macroscopic training variables are causal, like, are causally linked to hypertrophy with that level of skepticism, nothing's causal. Like, it's all associations. Like, it's all kind of like, we see that in broad trends, when these things increase or decrease, they tend to be associated with more or less hypertrophy. And there's a number of things that would accurately describe, and volume is one of them. But nothing is truly causal in like the very strictest sense of the word.
Nice. Yeah, I think you make a great case for volume as a whole, and I think we have a good understanding of what volume is now. And one of the things that you wanted to break down, or you did a really good job of breaking down within this article, was this seductive logic that people come to, where more muscle equals more strength. So if strength doesn't increase with more volume, or as higher volumes as some of this research is showing, then that volume must be like bloat, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, swelling, edema. What did you find to be wrong with that reasoning?
Yeah, so A couple things. So okay, the the argument that one will often encounter is that uh, higher training volumes in the research appear to lead to more muscle growth. But um, it is believed higher training volumes don't lead to larger strength gains. This understanding largely comes from the most recent meta regressions on the topic by Pelland and colleagues. Um, and I guess there are people who listen to this on podcast apps. Like it's not exclusively a YouTube thing. But whatever. If you could just like put the graphs in question in the show notes so people could see, that would be good. But yeah, like in these meta regressions, it looks like as set volume goes up, muscle growth goes up as well. But for strength, as set volume goes up, strength gains increase up to about 5 sets a week, give or take. And then they don't literally plateau like the specific like type of model they use. Like it's not a logarithmic model, but it's like pseudo logarithmic, I guess, like similar, whatever. But yeah, like so the regression line is still like very, very slightly going up, but for all intents and purposes, it looks like it's basically plateaued. And so people looked at that and said, well, it looks like strength isn't continuing to increase past pretty low volumes. But it looks like hypertrophy is still increasing. And, muscle is contractile tissue. Ultimately, the amount of parallel actin myosin cross bridges you can create is going to just be like a basic limiting constraint on how much force you can produce. And so, if you're building more muscle via like true myofibrillar hypertrophy, that should at least, like at minimum, increase your potential for strength gains. And so, if it's looking like higher volumes are leading to more muscle growth but not larger strength gains, eh, maybe you're not actually building more actual contractile proteins. Maybe what looks like growth is actually just sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Maybe it's just muscle swelling and edema, who knows? But it's unlikely to be truly myofibrillar protein accretion if you're not seeing larger strength gains with these higher volumes as well. And um, I I can understand why someone would make that inference, but it's also, I think, worth keeping in mind. Just kind of like how meta regressions in general work, and these meta regressions in particular. So basically, um, like meta regressions kind of exist in a vacuum, I guess you could say, where for the strength meta regression, they said like, hey, let's find all of the studies we can that look at the impact of different levels of training volume on strength gains. And for the hypertrophy meta regression, they said, hey, let's try to find all of the studies we can that look at the effect of different levels of training volume on muscle growth. But the thing is, like, there's just way more research on strength than hypertrophy. Um, a big part of that is just it's way easier to measure strength than hypertrophy. If you want to do a study where your exclusive outcome is strength, what do you need? Like you need some plates and a bar. Like that's about it, which is accessible to basically every researcher in the world. If you want to assess hypertrophy, at least for like modern standards of assessing hypertrophy, because like back in the day, like there are a lot of old hypertrophy papers where they just look at like flexed arm circumference or whatever, which used to be treated as like a very valid proxy for muscle size. But as research methods improve, things that are like pretty good but not great, we kind of say like, okay, that's it doesn't quite make the cut anymore. So now for a hypertrophy study to kind of like be taken seriously, it needs to be able to more directly assess muscle size. And so you want to be able to use at minimum ultrasound, but ideally CT, MRI, or take a biopsy and look at fiber cross-sectional area under a super high-powered microscope. Um, and so like those are kind of the four things we would treat as like pretty good measures of hypertrophy. Um, and all of them are very expensive. Like a good ultrasound machine new will run you like $60,000 or so. And I know like a lot of labs that don't have the best funding can get like used ultrasound machines for less, but like you're probably not going to find one that's decent for less than like 10-20,000 bucks. Like it is a pretty expensive piece of lab equipment. Um, and like no, I don't think any muscle physiology lab has its own MRI machine. Like every study where they're taking MRI measurements to assess muscle size, like it's a study that takes place in a university that also has like a medical research center, and the exercise science researchers just like pay for time on the MRI machine in another lab. Um, and like, yeah, it's yeah, yeah, it's just tougher to assess hypertrophy. Like the barrier to afford the equipment needed to do it is just higher than for strength. And so there's a lot more research on strength than there is hypertrophy. And so in these meta regressions, um, I think there were like 35 total studies on hypertrophy and like 66 on strength. And they were like relatively distinct sets of studies. Like there were, of all of the studies included, only 21 of them actually assessed hypertrophy and strength in the same group of subjects, which was like a fairly small minority of the total set of studies. Um, and so, when you're looking at the strength meta regression, it's showing you the relationship between training volume and strength gains in some studies that also assessed hypertrophy, but also in a lot of studies that didn't also assess hypertrophy. And so, for instance, let's just say there's a study that doesn't assess hypertrophy, but does assess strength gains in untrained subjects, where one group is doing like 2 sets a week and another group is doing 6 sets a week. And guess what? They both get way stronger because they're untrained subjects, and they're gonna improve their strength performance by like 30-40% literally just from practicing the lift. Um, well, that's going to be a plot near the left side, near the top of whatever graph you have, that's going to be tugging up on that regression line. Um, Whereas like the vast majority of the studies that test pretty high volumes do use trained subjects. Like there's a paper by Evangelista and a paper by Rodelli that test pretty high volumes in untrained subjects. Um, and all of the other high volumes studies were studies in trained subjects. And so like you have like a quite a lot of research looking at strength gains in mostly untrained subjects, training with pretty low volumes and getting way stronger with very low volumes. And then you have like a much smaller number of studies looking at strength gains in trained subjects, and of those, some use pretty high volumes. And in that set of studies, like, folks get pretty strong with higher volumes, but oftentimes they gain less, like these trained subjects training with high volumes gain less strength than untrained subjects training with quite low volumes. But then when you're analyzing all of those studies together, you're seeing a lot of low volume studies where folks are gaining just as much strength, but that doesn't necessarily imply that within the same group of subjects, higher volumes wouldn't still lead to larger strength gains. Just simply due to how regression works. um, and so what I wanted to do in for like early in this article is just say, okay, what do things look like in the studies where they're assessing both strength and hypertrophy, and they're assessing strength and hypertrophy in like common muscle groups. So basically, like, the studies where if a strength outcome is bench press 1 RM, they're also assessing changes in like pec thickness or triceps thickness. Or if the study is assessing, change in quad size or whatever, is it also looking at some strength measure that is going to be influenced by changes in quad size? So like squat 1 RM, knee extension 1 RM, something like that. Because like that's going to give you a better apples to apples comparison. Instead of just saying like, hey, here's one group of studies on strength, one group of like a mostly different group of studies on hypertrophy, and just what is the independent relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains in these, or between volume and hypertrophy and volume and strength gains in these two mostly different sets of studies. And so like when you narrow it down to the studies that do allow for that kind of like apples to apples comparison, a kind of different picture emerges where basically looks like higher volumes lead to more muscle growth, and higher volumes also lead to larger strength gains. And then, if it was true that higher volumes are having a larger impact on hypertrophy than on strength gains, you can make something called a bland Altman plot, which like now this is very far afield and definitely something where people should be able to see an image. And this is an audio medium. I used to podcast consistently. No one would ever be able to tell. But whatever, like it's basically a way to look at like how similar or different are two measurements across different levels of some independent variable. And in this case, the independent variable is number of sets performed, so like training volume. And then you can basically look and see like in these paired strength and hypertrophy measurements, is the gap between gains in strength and gains in muscle size, does that gap differ in these studies as training volume changes? And so basically, if it is true that hypertrophy kind of like plateaus, or if strength gains kind of plateau at lower volumes and hypertrophy continues increasing at higher and higher volumes, or appears to increase, then what you should see is a bland Altman plot with an overall negative slope, where basically there's a large gap between hypertrophy and strength gains in these studies at low volumes. And then as volume increases, the gap should get smaller and smaller and smaller. So basically, like if we're seeing the type of thing where like hypertrophy keeps increasing but strength plateaus, then at 5 sets a week or whatever, the gap between gains in muscle size and gains in strength, it might be like, okay, at 5 sets per week, people are gaining 15% more strength than muscle size. But at 30 sets per week, maybe people are only gaining 3% more strength than muscle size. So you'd wind up with a bland Altman with an overall negative slope. And that's not what we see. Like the gap between gains in strength and gains in muscle size is pretty consistent, kind of at all levels of volume that have been assessed up to this point. And in like all of these studies that are looking at like paired measures of strength and hypertrophy, like out of I think 35 total measurements, like 31 of them, the gains in strength exceeded the gains in muscle size, with that gap again being pretty consistent at all levels of volume. So Yeah, and I think that overall offers like the type of comparison that allows for better transitive inferences. So like essentially saying like, is the hypertrophy we're observing potentially contributing to the strength gains we're observing? If you want to make that type of inference, you need to kind of be able, like you need to be dealing with studies that would allow for that type of inference, like studies that assess both hypertrophy and strength in similar sets of muscle groups. And within that batch of studies, there's not really much evidence for volume having different impacts on strength than hypertrophy. Like it seems like higher volumes are better for strength and also better for hypertrophy, and similarly effective for both.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of talking about that kind of apples to oranges comparison and just people not diving into the data well enough. And the fact is, like you said, there's so much more research on strength, and the people that are within those studies are quite distinctly different to those within the hypertrophy research where there's less. So when you are actually comparing like apples to apples, we're seeing something different appear. So it's a problem when people are using that strength data to infer hypertrophy conclusions too heavily in that regard. Something else you also did a great job of, obviously you mentioned the meta-regression showing at 5 sets kind of strength started to plateau. There was also the meta-regression from Zach Robinson, which showed that strength kind of plateaued or didn't really increase much from about 10 RAR. It seemed people could train with really low volumes if they're going to make this inference, hey, you can grow from using like just 5 sets. You also use the data from Zach's paper and be like, well, couldn't we then infer 10 RAR is the way to go about it too? And using that as an example, I think just floors a lot of people's arguments right there and then.
Oh yeah. That was a bit of fairly obvious shit posting, but yeah, like I did just want to illustrate that okay, if your argument is that uh things that do actually lead to more myofibrillar hypertrophy should lead to larger strength gains, and if they don't, that gap must be explained by muscle swelling, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, whatever. And you look at the volume research and you say, hey, look, it looks like past 5 sets per week, muscle growth continues to go up, but strength plateaus. Therefore, what looks like muscle growth can't actually be the accrual of myofibrillar proteins, contractile proteins, because if it was, that would be contributing to strength gains. Like the flattening of that strength curve implies that this so-called hypertrophy we're observing is not actual hypertrophy. I just wanted to illustrate that like you can apply that to like other bodies of research to reach absurd conclusions, but like those are the conclusions you'd have to reach if you actually take this argument seriously. And so yeah, like you were saying, there was uh, a series of meta-regressions by Robinson that was published last year that looked at the impact of proximity to failure on muscle growth and strength gains. And like, I cannot overstate how little impact proximity to failure has on strength gains in the literature, at least. Like, I don't think that like, and I'll put a pin in this and circle back, but I do think that long term you need to do some training closer to failure if you're going to maximize strength gains. But you know, within the research we have, it really does not appear that proximity to failure impacts strength gains at all. And I mean, it's kind of for the same reason I think that it doesn't look like volume impacts strength gains that much. There's just a lot of fucking studies on untrained lifters who they do some type of any training and get a lot stronger because it's just kind of a practice effect. And even in studies on train lifters, like, yeah, you have some prior training experience, but you might not have much, if any, experience with the exact exercises being used in a study. And so again, like most of the strength gains are literally just going to come from practice, almost independent of the details of the training intervention itself. So yeah, like if you're if you're going to ignore all of that when you're looking at the volume literature and say, oh, no, mine go flat at above 5 sets per week. Like, you can look at the proximity to failure literature and say, oh, lines stay flat at all proximities to failure. As you're training closer to failure, it doesn't seem to be leading to larger strength gains. And yet, when you kind of tab over to the corresponding graph for hypertrophy in the same meta-regressions, sure looks like training closer to failure leads to larger gains in muscle size. And so, yeah, if you're going to apply the same logic that folks want to apply to the volume literature, you'd say, well, it looks like training closer to failure is leading to more muscle growth, but it's not actually resulting in larger strength gains. And if you're truly accruing more contractile proteins, those gains in muscle size should be contributing to larger strength gains. And since they don't, much like volume, like higher training volumes, it's a larger stressor. It causes more muscle damage. It causes more swelling. It's got to be the swelling thing. The same fucking thing applies to proximity to failure. You train with 10 reps in reserve. That's not causing much overall stress. That's not causing that much muscle damage. Train closer to failure. Go all the way to failure on an exercise, especially one you're unaccustomed to. Yeah, that's a larger stressor. It's going to cause more muscle damage. It's going to cause more swelling. And so, yeah, it looks like folks are gaining more muscle, but they're not gaining more strength. So that difference between the two, it must be due to swelling. It must be due to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, something like that. And if you want to make that argument for the volume literature, if you're going to be intellectually consistent, you need to apply it to the proximity to failure literature as well. So either I think this is the more reasonable approach, you don't do either. Strength data is strength data, hypertrophy data is hypertrophy data. Take them as they are, If you want to know about hypertrophy, look at the hypertrophy data, Or you wind up in a place where, logically, according to your own logic, optimal training for hypertrophy is like 5 sets per week with 10 reps in reserve. And if you don't believe that, you don't believe that argument that folks are trying to apply to the volume literature.
So well said. Yeah, it's funny how even with meta-regressions or meta-analyses, people like to cherry pick to try and suit their argument here. But when you outline it like that, it just completely obliterates any sort of consistency within their logic and reasoning. Something I need to ask, because there will be people thinking it, is with these studies of high volumes where there's 10, 15, 20 plus sets per muscle per week, people would be thinking, but when people go that high in sets, they're just sandbagging. They're at 3-4 RAR. They're not kind of to be taken with the seriously people pushing hard to failure with the lower effort training. So when even within those hypertrophy studies, you're not comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to watermelons in this case. What do you think to those arguments where people can't seriously be training that hard when they're going that high in volume?
I would say two things. One, I think they are training that hard. So there are so something that people do bring up as like a potential confounder is that oftentimes studies say that they involve training to failure, but how failure is defined is a little more slippery, I think, than people sometimes realize. Like, sometimes it is training to true concentric failure. Like, you do reps until you are unable to get another rep up. And sometimes it's more, like the term that's often used is volitional failure or volitional fatigue, which is essentially just like when the subject does not believe that they can do another rep, they cut it. And so, yeah, some studies use like true concentric failure, some use volitional fatigue. And of the ones that do actually use true concentric failure, if it's a competent research group, people are training to failure. Like, that's like, I don't know how to convince someone who hasn't actually spent time in a lab, but like, if a study protocol is like you're training to failure, you're fucking training to failure. And people are going to be far more motivated to do that in a study than than they would be in their own training, because you're going to have like between depending on the lift being done, between like 1 and 5 highly caffeinated master students screaming at you at the top of their lungs to encourage you to get another rep. And also, like, a lot of the people in these studies are university students, and if they complete the study, like, they might get $100, they might get extra credit in a class. Like, there's, you know, presumably they want to make gains, but there are also like other external incentives for them to continue in the study. And I've been a I've been a person administering training sessions in studies that involve people training to failure. And like, we're not stupid. Like, we can tell when people are sandbagging, like you will occasionally get subjects who like try to make it look like they're failing a rep when like, good and well, they still have like 2 or 3 more in them. And like, it's not pleasant, but you need to talk to your supervisor and say like, hey, this is what I think is going on. Your science is quite hierarchical. Like, unless the PI is actually the person in the lab, which like it's very rare that that would be the case. Usually it's going to be master students overseeing a lot of this stuff. And so they kind of got to run it up the food chain, like either talk to the PhD student that's like overseeing the study, or the principal instructor, like the professor that's like overseeing the PhD students, whatever. Like, you're not going to be empowered to like unilaterally kick someone out of a study, but like the training intervention itself has to be like valid and administered equally to everyone. And like people are on the same page about that. And if there's someone you think is sandbagging, you let someone know and say, hey, come take a peek like the next time this person is in. And then if they're sandbagging, you got to sit them down and have a tough conversation and say like, dude, I know you're not fucking trying. Like, you have 2 or 3 more reps in you. I'm not blind. I know it. You know it. And if you want to continue in this study, you're going to need to step it up. And then like, if they don't, you boot them. But oftentimes they do, because again, they want like $50 or like 5 points of extra credit in a class like that. It's kind of crazy how much a 21-year-old will do for like $50. Like, it's yeah. That's a enormous motivator for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I don't know. In studies that truly involve training to volitional failure, if it's a competent lab group, people are training to failure. And if someone doesn't believe that, that's fine, but like, you're wrong. And if you want to be convinced otherwise, sign up, do a master's, oversee a study, and you'll see. For studies that involve training to volitional fatigue, I think that it is plausible that folks maybe sandbag a little bit more when they're training with really high volumes. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say 100% that doesn't happen. But I will also say it's a distinction without a difference almost. So like, let's say there's a study where where one group is training with like 15 sets per week and another group is training with 30 sets per week, and they're training to volitional fatigue, and the group that's training with 15 sets per week, since the volume's a little lower, they're accruing less fatigue during each training session, and they do push themselves harder. Like, they're on the whole pretty accurate with cutting things off right when they want to be able to complete another rep, or like, maybe a couple people are like a little lazier and leave like 1 or 2 reps in reserve. And let's say the higher volume group, maybe they are sandbagging a little bit. Maybe they are leaving like 2 or 3 reps in reserve on some of their early sets to know that they'll have gas in the tank for their later sets. I wouldn't sit here and claim that never happens, but I will say, if that is happening, we're still seeing more growth in the folks training with higher volumes, So, um, and also, like, I don't know, I'm not an idiot. Like, I do think that that's how people would tend to apply higher volumes in the real world. Like, I think you run into problems if you go from training to failure with low volumes to training with like 8 reps in reserve all the time with higher volumes. Like, yeah, it looks like your volume is increasing, but like the stimulus per set is dropping so much that like maybe it comes out in the wash. You don't actually get better results from it. But if someone's trying to put a high level of effort into it and maybe their average proximity to failure drops from like, 1 rep in reserve with lower volumes to like 2 or 3 reps in reserve with higher volumes, yeah, like I think that's very plausible. And I think that's very plausible that that might be what happens in studies that involve people training to volitional fatigue. But in the studies where people are training to volitional fatigue, the higher volume groups still gain more muscle. So like, yeah, I think that as long as the quality per set doesn't just fall off a fucking cliff, the research suggests that folks are still getting better results from it. So, yeah, like I that to me, I don't know, like folks a criticism you'll hear not just about this, but like research more broadly is like, concerns about ecological validity. Like what people are doing in the lab might not be how people train in the real world all the time. And as far as like ecological validity goes, I actually have more concerns about the studies that do actually have people training to true concentric failure. Um, because like that isn't how most people train most of the time. In terms of just like pure scientific internal validity, it's great. Like you're standardizing the stressor as well as you possibly can. And you say, hey, people are training to failure. They're fucking training to failure. They're going until they can't do a rep anymore. So like you have high internal validity, but I do truly think that that's like a slightly less ecologically valid approach because yeah, like most people aren't taking every set they do to true concentric failure. Like that's not how most people train. Um, but yeah, like in studies with like very high internal validity, but maybe slightly lower ecological validity, higher volumes look like they're better. In the studies where people are training to volitional fatigue, which is, I think, more similar to how most people tend to train for hypertrophy, yeah, internal validity is a little bit lower. Like I do think it's very plausible that folks in the higher volume groups do leave a couple more reps in reserve, but I also think that's very fucking ecologically valid because I think that's what people tend to do when they train with higher volumes in practice. So like slightly lower internal validity, slightly higher ecological validity. And in those studies, higher volumes also seem to work better. So like no matter which genre of complaint you might have, yeah, there are other studies that should assuage it,
Yeah, very well said. So many great points, actually. And we actually had a podcast kind of almost round table, as it were, with different labs that were assessing hypertrophy and kind of talking about kind of one of these questions was like, how hard are people truly training? And they basically talk through that process of like really encouraging people. And like you said, almost people getting kicked out if they aren't doing what they need to be doing. And like you said, even if they aren't, we're still seeing better results with higher volume. So it's like, yeah, it's almost less, it's not a huge concern in that regard. So as an argument stands, if it doesn't stand on stable footing. It sounds like a good, strong argument for why these studies maybe aren't useful, but when you actually decipher it, it's like, well, actually, it doesn't do that at all. And I absolutely agree with you when I talk to your average person, but even your average, like, very serious lifter, if they say they take all their sets to failure, I can almost guarantee with like 99% certainty it isn't a concentric failure point where they are literally unable to do that rep. It is to the point where they're like, yeah, it's zero RER. That's what it is, right?
At best. If someone says they always train to failure and I say, oh, what's a lower body day look like? If they say, oh yeah, I start with squats, I'm like, okay, so you're lying. Like, no one in the world takes every set of squats to concentric failure. Like if you're winding up on the pins at the end of every set of squats, more power to you. But also, I'm doubtful. You know.
Yeah, that would be some horrendously gnarly training, and they wouldn't be able to do that for very long because I imagine an injury is just like inbound, especially if there's deadlifts afterwards. Something you said within the article, Greg, was how rationalism is the language of pseudoscience, which is a pretty strong statement to make. I'd love to hear you kind of expand upon why rationalism isn't the route people should go down.
Oh, okay. That's a hard pivot. Yeah, so okay. So I think that I think zooming out a little bit, I think a lot of the content out there that presents itself as, or like markets itself as like science-based content or whatever, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as science-based or really sciencey at all. Like I would tend to describe it as pseudoscience, because in essence, like science it's a process, but it's also a set of epistemological commitments. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is concerned about how we can claim to know what we know. And science is like fundamentally, or at least the hard biological sciences, because there are different types of sciences, whatever. This cannot turn into a philosophy of science podcast. I will make a recommendation for anyone listening to this. If you want to read more about philosophy of science, you should check out a book called What Is This Thing Called Science by Chalmers. It's a pretty easy read, and I think very interesting. But at least like modern hard biological sciences are empirical sciences, which is to say there is like the base epistemological commitment that truth or falsity is determined by the weight of the empirical evidence most directly supporting or refuting a particular claim. And so in essence, if you want to know, hey, do higher training volumes lead to more hypertrophy? Just to give a random example. You would say, okay, are there studies that have looked at this? In this case, yes. And then you'd say, what do they tend to find? And they tend to find that higher volumes tend to lead to more hypertrophy. And so you would say, as just kind of like your tentative base truth, higher volumes tend to be better for hypertrophy. And that's not necessarily where the process ends. Like anyone with their head screwed on straight, and with a single skeptical bone in their body might look at some of the things that we've talked about here, like, oh, maybe swelling could be influencing some of this stuff. You know, higher volumes, larger stressor, maybe there's still some residual swelling 48 to 72 hours after the final workout, which is when post-training hypertrophy assessments tend to be taken. And who knows, like maybe there's still some swelling present there. So you could say like, hey, look, the research tends to suggest that higher volumes lead to more muscle growth, but I do have this reservation. There's this unresolved question about swelling. And so, you know, I maintain some degree of skepticism about the generalizability of this body of research above like some level of volume. But as far as we know now, higher volumes tend to be better, and hopefully future research will address, you know, this means for skepticism that I currently have. And that's kind of the empirical approach. You say, like, what does the data say? Where is it strong? Where is it weak? What are things that could strengthen it further? But you wouldn't say, hey, the data says this, but like, I'm skeptical. Like, I think swelling might be influencing this a little bit. So actually, fuck the data. We know that hypertrophy is maximized at low volumes. Like, that's That's not what you would do necessarily. But yeah, so empiricism. Your exclusive commitment is not to the empirical data, but your primary commitment is to the empirical data. Rationalism is basically, do I want to be charitable or uncharitable? Whatever.
Let's go uncharitable. Let's go hard.
It's you could describe it when ideally applied, you're using logic and reason to reach, instead of inductive inferences, deductive inferences. So like like an empirical approach makes like inductive inferences. Like here's what we have previously observed, and from that we can make the inductive inference that we should continue to observe similar things in the future. Whereas a more rationalist approach tends to make more deductive inferences, where it's just kind of like start with the things you know, or at least think that you know, and then apply formal logic and reasoning to kind of like reach a conclusion at the end of it. Like the classic example of like a rationalist epistemology and making deductive inferences would be like how Sherlock Holmes solves a case at the end of all of his stories or movies or whatever. You have your evidence, and from that evidence you can deduce whatever the truth is. And like that has its place, certainly. But it tends to be most productive in things with higher degrees of certainty. So, I will not pretend like I understand modern physics. Like shit's getting fucking crazy. People detecting gravitational waves, particle accelerators, like whatever. I think that's cool. I won't pretend like I understand it, but like I do understand classical physics pretty well, and a lot of kind of like discoveries made in classical physics, I know were the result of deduction. Kind of like here are the things that we know, so we can deduce that this is how nature should behave. And then eventually, once like means to like make measurements got better, folks could kind of like test these logical deductive predictions, and a lot of them, like the vast majority, turned out to be correct. But like in biology, shit just gets like way messier because like you're not, you can't be who was it? I'm gonna show my whole ass here. Who predicted the orbit of Neptune? I think it was Kepler. Whatever, don't quote me on that. But basically, like,
you could tell me it's Kepler. I believe you.
But basically, like, I'm pretty sure it was Kepler. Like he had the measurements of the planets and the stars from his kind of like mentor Tycho Brahe, who I should note, crazy guy, absolute fucking G. He had like a really good telescope and just loved making like hyper accurate measurements of the positions of the planets and the stars every night for like 30-40 years. And like his data set is what like modern astronomy was built on, essentially. Like it was the best data that anyone had for like 200 or 300 years or whatever. But he himself was also like wild. He got his nose cut off. Like he lost his nose in a duel when he was younger. And so he was this like reclusive count, I think, who just like stayed in his castle, didn't really go out, didn't really socialize much, just hanging out in his castle with like a golden prosthetic nose.
Oh my gosh.
And if memory serves, a pet moose. He had some sort of very large atypical pet. I'm pretty sure it was a moose. But yeah, just this reclusive old bachelor with a gold nose, a pet moose, just looking at the stars every night and gathering the best data anyone had ever seen. But
living
whatever.
his best life.
So I'm not sure about Neptune, but I do know that like his data was like accurate enough that when Kepler got a hold of it, he was just like, these can't be circular orbits. Like that was how the discovery that the planets had elliptical rather than circular orbits was made, because like
Wow.
his data was accurate enough that they were like that Kepler was like, the only way this makes sense is if these orbits are actually elliptical. And that was like a deductive inference from the data. Like you couldn't zoom out at a universe level and observe um, that the orbits were truly elliptical. Like that is a deductive inference that had to be made that was later proved correct. So just as an example of like when that can work well. Um, but yeah, biology is really fucking messy. Like you're not just dealing with some planets tugging on each other with gravity and all that. Um, like you're dealing with the complex interactions of like tens of thousands, if not millions, of biomolecules. And so for deductive inferences to kind of be sound, you kind of need to be able to construct or like for you to be able to have like a high degree of confidence in deductive inferences, it needs to be the type of scenario where, going back to causality, like we discussed earlier, like like B necessarily follows from A, C necessarily follows from B. Like you can draw a straight line between like your premises and the conclusion, because there is like a strong necessary causal relationship between all of the variables in this string of logic. And like that's just literally not how biology works. Like an example I gave in the article is like if you were to make a rationalist case for supplementing with BCAAs. Yeah, BCAAs are one of the best supplements you can take. Um, you start with the premise that hypertrophy is the result of net protein accretion exceeding protein breakdown, and therefore anything that simultaneously increases protein synthesis and decreases protein breakdown will lead to more hypertrophy. And like there is acute data showing that BCAAs both increase muscle protein synthesis and decrease protein catabolism. But like we have plenty of longitudinal data showing that like, yeah, when overall protein intake is adequate, BCAAs don't do shit for you, you know? Um, and so yeah, like the reason I said in the article that rationalism is the language of pseudoscience is just that like kind of it is. I don't know. Like what just hit me with something. What's a like I don't want to step on too many people's toes, but what's like a popular health related belief floating around right now that a lot of people believe that like you think the vast majority of people in your audience would agree is pseudoscience?
The one that I don't know why this is immediately coming to mind, but like fasted cardio is inherently better for fat loss than
Oh,
at other
yeah,
times of day.
that's perfect. Um, so yeah, fasted cardio, um, fat loss, ultimately the case that you need to break down more fat than you're accruing. Instead of net protein balance, we're now dealing with net fat balance. And before fatty acids can be catabolized, they have to first be liberated. You need some lipolysis to take place. Um, and, ultimately, what fat balance is going to do during the rest of the day kind of is what it is. But if you just compare like to like cardio session, fasted versus fed, lipolysis is greater in a fasted state. Um, and especially at lower intensities, the overall ratio of fat burned to carbs burned, like your respiratory exchange ratio tends to be lower when you're doing fasted cardio versus fed cardio. Um, and so, yeah, like
I'm sold.
logically, it has to be better for fat
Yeah.
loss. And the thing is, like, That's the reason it's still so popular. Like that is the pitch people make, which is a perfectly rational belief. It's a perfectly logical belief. Um, and like it's also it doesn't appear to be true. And like we can be pretty confident it's not true because there's been research on fasted cardio and it doesn't seem to result in more fat loss over time than cardio in a fed state does. And in the case of fasted cardio, we do kind of know why. Um, like it's not just a matter of like the fat you're burning during a workout is such a small percentage of your total like energy metabolism during a day that it's probably inconsequential. And also like after a fasted cardio bout, potentially your fat cells are maybe a little more sensitive to uptake more fatty acids afterwards. And so, you're seeing a lower respiratory exchange ratio during exercise, but like it might rebound and elevate a bit once you eat again, and it just kind of comes out in the wash. But if you just want to make the case for fasted cardio, you can make a very logical and persuasive case that it's going to be better. And that's like that is the case for all pseudoscience. Like no one, like no matter what ridiculous thing people are doing, people are getting interested in, that like you as a more tuned in person, like yeah, you're listening to the Revive Stronger podcast, you understand fitness and health and hypertrophy related stuff better than the average person does. I'm what the kids would say. I'm glazing your audience right now, but for good reason. You're a smart guy. You have good guests on. Like I'm sure your audience is like a lot more clued in than most people would be. And so for the people listening, stuff that you see where you're just like, that's clearly bullshit. Why do people fall for this? If you look at like the marketing and the content around it, what you will always find is logical arguments. And they're sometimes things that are like pretty airtight that just fucking break down when people actually like gather empirical evidence, like kind of the case of BCAAs, or it's something like fasted cardio where the arguments that people are exposed to make it look very effective, but there is kind of like some stuff on the back end that maybe isn't mentioned. But hey, in content and marketing, the proponents of fasted cardio can just kind of like ignore that, sweep it under the rug. And yeah, like people don't just like believe shit for no reason. And like overall, people tend to find logic to be pretty persuasive. Because like that's how our brains like our brains are more like logic engines and like empiricism engines at the end of the day. And I think that's one of the reasons that like rationalism is like even if someone wouldn't, even if someone's never thought about this topic at all and wouldn't like self-describe themselves as a rationalist versus an empiricist, I think like most people are just tacitly rationalists because like unless you're like unless you have scientific training, like if you try to solve problems in your life, most of the time you're just going to sit down and like think through shit logically, like that's what our brains are like kind of good at. Whereas like the process of systematically gathering and statistically analyzing data, like that's pretty fucking opaque, like that it takes some like specialized training. It's a lot, it takes way more time and effort. Yeah, like that's that it I think it feels like a little unnatural unless like until you do a lot of it, I guess. Um but yeah, so I think that that's something that like pseudoscientists and charlatans can easily prey upon. And oftentimes, like just to be fairly charitable, um, like I don't think that the vast majority of people promoting fasted cardio, like I don't think most of them are charlatans. Like I don't think that they're like I think that they're promoting it because they truly believe it's better. And I think they truly believe it's better because there is like a persuasive logical case for it. And they find that convincing. And then they pass it along to their followers. Their followers find it convincing. And now, yeah, suddenly there's a lot of people believing what I think most people listening to this podcast would understand to be pseudoscience. And they do it on the basis of logic, even though it conflicts with the strongest, most relevant empirical evidence on the topic. And so, like, I discussed this in the article, but like that is truly my main beef with like rationalism as a primary epistemic commitment from people who purport to be like evidence-based or science-based. Like, to be entirely clear, I do not fucking care at all if someone is like like I cannot overstate how little I care what people believe. Like, I am I'm very nihilistic about most things. As long as the things you believe aren't influencing action that leads to the direct harm of other people, I do not care what people believe. Truly and honestly, I don't give a shit. And so, yeah, I don't care that there are people who think lower training volumes are better. And I don't care that, and I also generally don't care how people reach conclusions and come to the beliefs that they hold. Like, I accept that most people are just like tacitly rationalists. That's how our brains tend to work. And unless you have scientific training, like that's how you're gonna think through shit rather than like systematically collect data to answer questions. Like, that's fucking normal. I get that. The only thing I have a bee in my bonnet about is just like people who purport to be or brand themselves as science-based and then just have epistemic commitments that are fundamentally antithetical to scientific epistemology, which is primarily empirical. And I think that if you are putting yourself out there as someone who communicates science, you're a science-based person, whatever, and you are modeling for your audience primarily rationalist modes of inference rather than empirical modes of inference, you are modeling the types of persuasive processes used by pseudoscientists and charlatans. And I am not saying you yourself are a charlatan. I am kind of saying that you yourself are a pseudoscientist, because that is what pseudoscience is. Like, it's something that seems science-y. You might even be citing some studies here and there, but you're fundamentally not using the scientific process to answer questions. And yeah, like that's the only thing I kind of have a bee in my bonnet about. Like, if you're purporting to be science-based, you should have the epistemic commitments of the sciences that you're leaning on to answer questions. And the sciences you're leaning on to answer questions are empirical sciences.
So well said, Greg. The reason I wanted to pivot to this, because I definitely wanted to cover it in the episode, because I just found it such a compelling argument within your article, and it was just, I found myself nodding along the way. Something you also mentioned there, I think, is that some people also, they're not one or the other. Like, for you very much rely on being an empiricist, but I've definitely seen people within our space who knock around both, and I've definitely been very easily convinced of their rational argument, because, like you said, you can seem a bit more confident. It can be a bit more appealing. You don't have to like bring up all this data or be kind of tentative, like, oh, we need more data. You can, like, people are fairly overconfident with those things. You can almost call rationalism, I think, bro science almost. They almost could be termed the same sort of thing. And I've been caught out like that. So it's thanks to people like yourself, Greg, who have really dialed in my skepticism towards things, where someone might ask my opinion on something and I'm a rationalist, and I could have my rationalist response, but I know I'm so underwhelmed in terms of the knowledge base I have on this. I ain't got a clue. Like, I don't want to give an opinion on this. It's similar to the Dunning-Kruger almost, where you think you know everything, and then you realize, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't know. So you sound like so unsure about many things because you probably should.
Yeah, no. Truly, the more I learn, the less confident I am in almost anything. Yeah.
It relates to something else. I don't know if you've heard of this, Greg. I've heard this term recently called knowingness, where it's just like people have a feeling that they already know something. And I just think, I don't know, I think about, and this is a bit of a generalization, but guys with like lifting and eating, like the amount of times I talk to a general guy in the gym, maybe like, oh yeah, I know how to train my legs, and they're pretty big because I played football. And it's just like, you think you got big legs because you played like football or soccer, whatever, like it's like basically cardiovascular based sport. Like, that's not why you've got big legs, and you probably haven't, because they're probably surrounded by loads of fat. But yeah, it's that sense of knowingness and then not being willing to update their beliefs and almost doubling down on it through the route that you said, in terms of just playing on people's logic based brains. That doesn't mean they're absolutely correct. Another one within our space that I've seen used a lot is looking at mechanisms and not outcome data, and heavily kind of purporting that this is the way to go because look at these mechanisms and look how they work in like a Petri dish or whatever it is. It's like, but they don't update their beliefs when we have outcomes that show differently. They maybe just start not reporting that data.
Yeah, which is, it's kind of circular, right? So if there are mechanisms and there are presumed mechanisms, and a presumed mechanism is essentially like, you've identified some, I don't know, like some biomolecule that in some like in vitro study or in some rodent model appears to lead to a particular outcome. Or it appears to like be associated with or like influence some particular outcome that someone might care about. And so, at that point, you're dealing with like a presumed mechanism. You think that this thing is causally related to an outcome you're interested in. How do you think that someone would go about validating such a mechanism? It's with longitudinal empirical evidence. Like that's how you do it. Like if you have a mechanism that conflicts with the outcome data, you don't have a mechanism. Like you have a mechanism that was a presumed mechanism that has now been refuted by the relevant empirical evidence that would be required to validate that this presumed mechanism is truly a mechanism. And so it truly, like, it's not a either or thing, like a mechanisms or outcome thing. Like you need the outcome to validate what you believe the mechanisms to be. And so if you're saying like, well, the outcome data says this, but the mechanistic evidence says Y. The mechanistic evidence does not say anything. Like, the mechanistic evidence should lead you to hypotheses about the outcomes that those mechanisms should produce. But once we've observed that they don't actually produce those outcomes, they aren't fucking mechanisms. Like, in the strictest sense, like, it is still something that may like influence or be associated with sometimes the outcome that you're interested in, but it doesn't like mechanistically bring about the outcome if the relevant empirical evidence shows that it doesn't directly bring about this outcome. Like that's not what a mechanism is,
For sure. To wrap that section up, I'm going to leave the listeners with a quote from the article where you said basically, if you make a claim, the strength of that claim should scale with the strength of the evidence. I think that's the simplest way to just show why empiricism is important. And again, if people are making claims based off limited to no data, you can pretty much squash them there and then. It's pseudoscience, as you mentioned. So then we're going to go back to like volume, where we were, and basically making a case for kind of, obviously we've gone over what volume is, why it's important, and the fact that when we compare apples to apples, we do actually see more volume leads to more hypertrophy. Something I did want to cover is a lot of people will be potentially thinking, but when we're looking at especially naturals who grow very slowly, one of the measures that we might use to know if the thing we're doing is working and that we're growing is that we're hitting kind of strength PRs in the hypertrophy rep range over time. Can you just, you had kind of 4 ways of being that when, sorry, you had 4 times of which when these changes in strength can be pretty strongly reflected of hypertrophy. Can you touch on those 4, or I can set you up for them? I have them down.
No, I think I remember.
Cool.
Yeah, and this also relates going back to the ways that someone might want to make inferences from research. Like I think that there's a tendency to read research through kind of like a personal lens where you kind of think like, okay, like the results of the study are in keeping with what I would more or less expect to happen if I tried to do some type of training that kind of comports with the training protocols used in the study. And if the outcomes of the study differ from what you might reasonably expect if you did something similar, I think people have a tendency to be like, must be bullshit. Like, this is bad science. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that the context, like your personal context and the context of the studies you're reading, could differ dramatically. And that difference could mean that like the findings of the study wouldn't necessarily generalize to you. Like, like the results are what they are, but then there is kind of the question you need to ask yourself of like, okay, but who would these results apply to and generalize to? And maybe it's you, maybe it's not you. And so like something that we see in the research, which causes a lot of consternation, is that like hypertrophy and strength gains are often like very weakly associated or potentially not associated at all in a lot of studies. There was actually, God, I forget the researcher's name, but it's cited in the article somewhere. Do you remember the classic Hubal study looking at biceps growth from like 2004?
That's I don't remember it. No.
Okay, so
I won't lie.
It's I think maybe the largest longitudinal training study ever done. It had 585 subjects, and its main purpose was just to quantify variability in training outcomes. So like it wasn't it didn't have a hypothesis. Like it wasn't like, oh, higher training loads will lead to larger strength gains or higher volumes will lead to more muscle growth. It was just like, we're going to take damn near 600 subjects and put them all on the exact same training program for their biceps and literally just look to see the spread of responses. Like, what do gains in 1 rep max bicep curl strength look like? How much does that vary between individuals? What do gains in like isometric torque output look like? How does that differ between people? What do gains in, I forget if they looked at thickness or cross-sectional area in that study, but whatever, just gains in bicep size. Like, what's the average there? What's the spread between individuals? Like that was its purpose, just like documenting that variability. I did not realize this, but that study is still ongoing. Like they
Wow.
published preliminary findings in like 04, 05. But there's a preprint out, like it just came out maybe like 2 months ago or something like that. And it's up to like, I think close to 1,200 subjects now. And they're looking to see now kind of like, okay, what is the relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains? And can we finally, this blows people's minds a little bit, I think. Um, once this study clears peer review and is published, which like I have no reason to think it wouldn't, like it's a high quality piece of research. But you know, like there's a convention now that I think is very good of papers being put up on preprint servers first. So if peers do have any criticisms of it, the manuscript can be kind of like improved and corrected before it's actually submitted. So it's kind of like in that phase right now, but there's every reason to expect that it will get published soon. But and like this cannot turn into like a long method on or a long section on statistical methods, but there are ways that you can like statistically establish causation, or at least like statistically make strong causal, like a strong case that a relationship is causal rather than merely associative. And to this point, like it's one of those things that just so intuitively feels like it must be true that I believe is true. I think almost everyone listening to this podcast will believe is true. But we don't actually have like formal like proof that hypertrophy does truly causally contribute to strength gains. I was involved, I think in 2017, in a back and forth with a group led by Lineker about this. Like we published a point counterpoint, which is also linked somewhere in the article. Yeah, I'll let me just make a note to myself real quick. I'll send over some of these papers so they can be linked in the show notes. But yeah, there it was still a topic of scientific debate whether hypertrophy does actually causally contribute to strength gains or not. I was on the side that it does, and there was another group on the other side arguing that it wasn't causally, like hypertrophy wasn't causally related to strength gains. But it was still a topic of legitimate scientific debate because there was not like formal, like there was not evidence that formally established a causal relationship. And this study that has been running since some point in the early aughts, which now has like close to 1,200 subjects, now has enough data to employ the types of statistical procedures that would be necessary to like formally establish a causal link. And surprise, surprise, the moment we've all been waiting for, we can now say with a reasonable degree of confidence that hypertrophy does causally contribute to strength gains.
Thank goodness.
But that is, like I said, that is something that is, that's relatively recent in the research. And at this point, it is still just a preprint. Like I said, it's going to get published, but currently it's not published. And so, all of which is to say, if you look at the research, it doesn't look like there's that strong of a relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains sometimes. And that sometimes is the context that a lot of studies take place in. And that sometimes is also not the context of most people listening to this podcast. So in studies where you're dealing with untrained subjects or subjects with very low training status, or in studies where people are training exercises that they don't already have a high degree of proficiency in, we don't see a strong relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains. And just kind of like more practically, kind of like big manipulations in training variables can kind of divorce that relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains. Just as an example, in research on high load versus low load training, they seem to lead to pretty similar hypertrophy on average, but heavier training at least like short to medium term, leads to larger strength gains than low training does. So that kind of like weakens the association between hypertrophy and strength, contingent upon like manipulating training variables. And we also tend to see a weaker relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains in more like short-term observations. Like in a 6-week, 8-week training study, we don't see much of a relationship between hypertrophy and strength gains. In longer studies, we tend to. And so like, yeah, on one hand, it is true that like, so in the research, we oftentimes don't see much of a relationship between muscle growth and strength gains. But all of those things I just laid out tend to not apply to like serious trainees. Like your training status is pretty high. The lifts you're doing in your program are probably lifts that you've been doing for a while. You're already pretty good at them. Whatever approach to training you have is probably reasonably consistent. You know, like if you tend to bench press for sets of 8-ish reps, you'll probably keep benching for sets of 8-ish reps. It may go up and down a little bit, but you know, you're not going to randomly switch from like, okay, this block I'm only doing heavy triples, next block I'm only doing sets of 20 or whatever, you know. And also, you know, if you're serious about this stuff, and especially if your training status is pretty high and it takes you a while to get measurably stronger, like you're necessarily kind of interested in tracking progress in your lifts and exercises over relatively long time scales instead of just looking to see how performance in like a new exercise might improve over like 6 weeks or whatever. And so like if you meet all of those criteria, like strength progress is, I think, pretty informative about hypertrophy. And like most people listening to this, that context I just described is your context. You have reasonably high training status. You're not just like subbing in lifts, like new exercises willy-nilly. It's pretty consistent. Your general approach to training is probably pretty consistent, and you're interested in analyzing things over longer time scales. That is your normal context. That is a bizarre context for a research study. Like that's not the those aren't the descriptors one would apply to most studies. Like most are in people with like 0 to fairly low training status. There's not like a lead in to make sure people have a high degree of proficiency with the lifts that they're going to be doing before you start taking pre-training assessments. And yeah, like they last a couple of months, you know? So, yeah, I think that that's something that confuses people. Like oftentimes in research, it doesn't look like there's much of a relationship, but that doesn't imply that, there won't be a pretty decent relationship between gains in performance and hypertrophy for you, nor does it imply that the research is wrong if it doesn't find that relationship, because within the context the studies are done, there's not much of a relationship, and you wouldn't really expect there to be.
I think that was so well demonstrated. And I think the mind-blowing bit in terms of the fact that this has been such a, I guess it's like such a foundational understanding that, hey, more muscle, more strength is like, a lot of people will be like, yeah, we know that to be true, but it's we haven't actually got strong data to back it up until very recently, like you just mentioned. Well, hopefully the preprint gets published and Lennicky's group doesn't somehow stop that happening. I'm sure it will. And then exactly as you described, the listeners here, they're going to be of a decent training status. They're going to be using lifts that they've had in for an extended period of time. And so actually it becomes quite a strong marker of whether or not something is working. And that's one of the prime tools of assessment I use myself and with my clients, that whatever X kind of program I'm using is successful. And if I make Y change, is it leading to more strength out, like faster strength progress or what have you? And if it is, that's probably a good sign, because I haven't got a lot of other objective data to go by. So I'm glad that you kind of outlined that, hey, don't just forget about strength. It does have some form of relationship towards your hypertrophy programming.
For sure. And the point I was making with that in the article, at least, is like I was I was responding to criticism from a prior article that I wrote, which was basically just saying like, hey, strength data is strength data, hypertrophy data is hypertrophy data. Don't make hypertrophy inferences from the strength data. And people said like, well, for me, strength is like a pretty decent indicator of hypertrophy. And the point is like, yes, that's true. I don't contest that. Um, for most people who have a fair bit of training experience, that is a pretty good proxy measure. Like you don't have a fucking MRI machine in your house. If you want an indicator of whether you're growing, strength is a more sensitive indicator, and yeah, the two things should be related. If your performance is improving, you're probably getting bigger. That is true. Like I believe that. I do not contest that. And yet, you are not the median subject in most of these research studies. And within the studies being done for the reasons just discussed, you should not expect there to be that same type of relationship. Like you listening to this probably can make reasonably decent inferences about hypertrophy for you from your strength progress within the populations being studied and the types of studies being done in the research. You can't use the data from those studies to make confident inferences about hypertrophy from the strength data that's observed.
Yeah. Very well said. With everything we've said here, I think hopefully people are following along that, hey, volume seems to be important for growth. More of that, it's a potent stimulus for growth. But something some people might be thinking is, hey, you mentioned how important kind of looking at these actual studies is. And a lot of these studies, they're actually only 8 to 12 weeks long. So can we actually be confident that we're going to see more growth from more volume over the long term? Can we extrapolate these acute trends over longer time frames?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's the short answer. Yeah, so it is like that is that is one of the better or one of the bigger open questions in exercise science research, like strength research, hypertrophy research. Essentially, like to what extent can we extrapolate results from shorter term studies to longer term training outcomes? And like can we, and to what extent can we, and what does the nature of that look like? And like I said, just to be like completely transparent, that is an open question. Like to be able to confidently answer that question, what we would need is like 5-year training studies where you assess hypertrophy and strength gains 3 months into the study, and then you assess them 4.75 years after that, and then look to see like, hey, these differences in outcomes that we observed at 3 months, do they hold up after? I use 5 years as just like a long period of time. A more feasible study might be 1 year or 2 years or whatever, but basically just like, do these relative differences that we observe in shorter term studies, do they hold up longer term? And yeah, kind of the longest you'll ever see a study go, like I don't say that as just like a complete categorical statement. Like there are a handful of like gerontology related studies, like community based interventions to reduce like sarcopenia and fall risk that run for like several years, but they're not typically looking at like maximizing hypertrophy. So there are some longer training studies, but not a ton. And the ones that exist for kind of like healthy younger adults doing like pretty hard training, you don't tend to see really anything past about 6 months. And And the handful of studies I can think of that do run longer than that typically don't involve like an actual training intervention. Like there was a study on like rugby players that was basically just kind of like characterizing changes in like strength and lean mass over the course of like 2 years, but it wasn't like, do those changes differ based on like training volume or whatever. It was purely just kind of like, hey, here's what we're observing over a 2-year time window when people are doing the training that their strength coach assigns to them, basically. But yeah, so in terms of just like intervention studies, 6 months is about as long as you're ever going to see. And in general, of the studies we do have that run like 6 months, if they include midpoint measurements, the things that look more effective at 3 months also tend to look more effective at 6 months as well. But like within the context of an entire training career, 6 months is also still like a relatively short time horizon. So there is some reason to be optimistic that and also even just within kind of the more typical range of like studies lasting 6, like most of the time, if like a meta-analysis has like inclusion criteria for study length, they kind of say like, if a study's less than 6 weeks, we're probably not actually seeing changes due to this actual training manipulation, so let's just ignore that. So most like longitudinal studies you see will be 6 weeks on the low end up to 16 weeks on the high end. And the 16 weeks on the high end is basically just like that is the length of an academic semester. And so, and I'll also note that's why most studies are like 8 to 12 weeks. Academic semesters are around 16 weeks, give or take. And most of the time, recruitment for studies and enrollment happens around the start of the semester. And so you have new subjects trickling in for about the first 4 weeks. And then, once people start finishing up, you continue to have data collection for about another 4 to 6 weeks or whatever for post-training assessments. And so, 8 to 12 weeks is like the feasible study length. Because like, again, most of these studies are on like college students, and the ones that aren't on college students are still mostly just getting like a ton of free labor from master students who are also kind of beholden to academic calendars. And so, for feasibility reasons, 8 to 12 weeks tends to be the norm. And 16 weeks is like if a research team really has their shit together and they do all of their recruitment in like the previous academic semester, and they can like do their pre-training assessments on fucking day 1 of the next semester and run a study for like the full 16 weeks. So like that's about as long as it's feasible to push most of these studies. But yeah, so most of the time, the training interventions that look more effective over 6 weeks, like 6 to 8 weeks, like the shorter end of the longitudinal studies, versus like 12 to 16 weeks, like the longer end of the longitudinal studies. We also tend to see pretty similar results there. Like it's pretty rare for something to look like either way more or way less effective at 6 weeks and then not way more or way less effective at 16 weeks. So all I'm trying to get at is like we do have some hints that we can extrapolate this stuff a bit. Like things that we observe at 6 to 8 weeks seem to extrapolate to 12 to 16 weeks pretty well. And in the very few handful of cases where we have 32-week training studies, like things observed at midpoints also tend to extrapolate to like another 16 weeks after that. So, but again, 6 months is still like relatively short in the grand scheme of things. So it is still an open question about how and the degree to which this stuff extrapolates. And I realize I've rambled about this far too long, but I did just want to give the best lay of the land that I could. Like there are reasons to have some degree of confidence about the extrapolatability of this stuff, but we also still don't know for sure. And like that must be acknowledged. But if things do extrapolate, it is probably with something that kind of looks like a logarithmic relationship. So like a criticism that you'll often see, like I talked about it in the article, I talked about it in the context of volume research, but like it's a criticism that you'll see of just like exercise science research more broadly, where like in a lot of these studies, over 8 to 12 weeks, people increase muscle size by like 5-10% or something like that. And folks look at that and they're like, that's fucking bullshit. Like if someone, like if their biceps got 5 to 10% bigger every 3 months, dude, they'd be fucking Ronnie Coleman in like 3 years. So like clearly this is bullshit. The results of the study can't generalize to the real world, blah, 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 whatever. And the thing is, like, that would be true if one were a dumbass and assumed that we're dealing with geometric growth rates. And by that I mean like we're dealing with growth that looks like the stock market, you know. If you say that stocks tend to go up by like 7% per year, that's 7% compounding upon previous gains of 7%. And so when you plot things on a linear axis, it looks like, oh, like stocks did not go up at all until like the 50s or whatever, and then boom, like hockey stick goes up very high very quickly. But for like people at the time, it was just kind of similar in each era as you went along, but like the relative gains were like smaller absolute gains because the baseline was lower. But for training outcomes, we're probably dealing with something less like a geometric relationship and more like a logarithmic relationship. So basically, like, you know, initially steep gains, and then gradually less steep gains, and then gradually even less steep gains. Where, you know, like an amount of progress that initially takes you 2 months, to make that same amount of progress again, it might take 4 months. And then to make that same amount of progress again, it might take another 8 months. And then to make that same amount of progress again, it might take another 16 months, you know, like gradually reducing rates. And I like in the handful of not like intervention studies, but just like long-term observational studies we have, logarithmic curves do seem to like be our best way to model like long-term strength progression over time. So I think that that's, you know, I wouldn't say that like gains in muscle size and strength are literally logarithmic over the long term, but just for like thinking about it conceptually, that is kind of the family of curves that probably best describe that long-term relationship. And so like if shorter term training interventions, if we can extrapolate them, we're probably dealing with like extrapolating different like pseudo logarithmic relationships where, you know, something like if higher training volumes in the research lead to 10% muscle growth over 2 to 3 months, and lower training volumes lead to 5% growth over 2 to 3 months, it's probably not going to lead to another 5 to 10% increase in growth over the next 2 to 3 months. But I think it is probably fairly likely that like relative gap will tend to persist. Maybe not permanently, but at least for like a pretty long period of time. But you're just dealing with like logarithmic growth instead of geometric growth. I do also think it's plausible. Like I should acknowledge that, like I said, we don't know for sure how this shit extrapolates. And I do think it's plausible, at least, that like, you know, there is the concept of like your genetic limit. And I do think it's plausible that training interventions that seem more effective in the short term are also more effective in the long term, but also just tend to get you to more or less the same place regardless, you know? So, you know, maybe with like the generally more effective training, you start approaching your genetic limits in like 5 years. And with like still effective, but like somewhat less effective training, maybe you start approaching your genetic limits in like 8 years. But like you kind of get to the same place. I don't know that that's the case, but I do also think that that's maybe a plausible way that things could look long term. But yeah, the honest answer is we don't know for sure. But whatever long term extrapolations look like, I think assuming kind of like logarithmic extrapolations is probably the most justifiable way to kind of like tentatively extrapolate things.
Very well explained. And that's funny, you actually touched on a point I was going to ask about. And your answer shouldn't surprise me now that I know you're a bit nihilistic in terms of that genetic cap, because there will be people, as you mentioned, people will be like, well, what's the point of, like, you might be able to grow faster, but we're all going to end up hitting our cap anyway. So you might as well enjoy not kind of going to those vastly diminishing returns of high volume, spending hours in the gym. Just go a bit slower, enjoy growing a bit slower, but for longer. You're going to end up at the same destination anyway. And that presupposes that you're going to hit a genetic cap. And I have one of those mindsets of like, there is no ceiling. I'm not going to reach it. And it's only my lack of like ability to commit to the process and do as much as my body can do. And I'll keep growing if I keep going type of deal. And I think a lot of people end up hitting a ceiling due to life. Like, I don't know, they have kids or business takes over or they get injured and they can't commit as much. Whereas if you can keep committing to it and get your life in order as best you can, and you have the right circumstances, you can keep growing. But again, it's one of those, we don't have an answer there, right? It makes sense a genetic ceiling exists. Whether or not you meet it, I mean, you'll never know. And once you get to, I joked that any advanced natural bodybuilder is basically at that point of PUOS that they termed in Jake Remet's paper, where you can't be certain that more sets than 11 within one session is really leading to any more outcomes, positive outcomes. And like, as an advanced natural bodybuilder of 15 years of training, you're almost at this point where you might be growing, but I mean, you have to invest so much time before you pull back to know if you are, that it's like, is that investment worth it at that point? For some people, it's not going to be worth the trade-off of investment to the potential payback it might bring of a few more grams of muscle.
Oh, for sure. And also, like, I will note that if like let's say you're really getting after it, training hard, training smart for a long period of time, like a logarithmic growth curve and a true genetic ceiling that functions as like an asymptote on that graph, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the two. So like I mentioned that there's like the papers that have been able to look at like long-term observational data that kind of showed that like, logarithmic curves seem to do pretty well. One of those was just looking at progression of like powerlifting careers from the open powerlifting data set over like a close to 20-year time horizon. And the nature of those logarithmic curves basically imply that like the gains that you experience in like your first 10 weeks of training, like not hypertrophy, like this is strength data. I think hypertrophy is probably a little bit different, but at least in terms of like strength progress, the amount of strength gains you see in like your first 10 weeks are probably comparable to the strength gains that you'll see over approximately the next 2 years. And then the strength gains that you experience over your first 2 years of training are probably comparable to the strength gains you'll experience over your next about 20 years of training. And so, you know, if you plot that on a logarithmic axis and your ticks are time 1, 10, 100, 1,000 in terms of weeks, looks like linear progress. But then when you put that back on a linear axis, that logarithmic curve is technically still going up, but it looks pretty fucking flat after a while, you know, to where, if there is truly no genetic limit, and like if we were an ageless species, we're like the high elves from Tolkien, and we've been around since the first age. And if that was the case, and you could keep training, keep growing, never aging, then maybe with a 5,000 year time scale, all of us could be Ronnie Coleman. But aging exists, you know. There will be a point where like, even if you could be 25 forever, you could keep growing forever, but at some point you'll be 60, and biology is just going to be working against you. And if you've been training for the last 40 years, you're you're probably in a state of managed decline at that point, like
Yeah.
even if aging didn't exist, you could have kept growing, but it does exist, so you can't, like
Yeah.
you're gonna hit a time wall if nothing else, because we get old and we die. And that being the case, yeah, like if like a logarithmic growth curve with truly no ceiling versus a hard cap that's like your genetic limit, they're going to be indistinguishable for you. Like it's going to look and feel the exact same way, whether or not like a true like limit exists.
Yeah. So well explained. I think a lot of people get those two things a little bit twisted there, and it makes a lot of sense also that, hey, no one is claiming that the amount of growth that we're seeing in these shorter term studies is going to continue happening, kind of similar to, hey, when you first start lifting and you gain, I don't know, you can add 2 kilos to your bench every couple of weeks. Once you're months in, you're not going to be able to keep that going because you're suddenly going to become the world's strongest man. These things are going to slow down, but that relationship still holds, that the more volume you can do and recover from effectively, you're still going to grow more than if you did less. It's just not as fast as what it was initially because you're adapting, and adaptive resistance is a thing. And like anything in life, you don't see those initial newbie gains like you initially did. So that makes a ton of sense. I'm aware that we've been chatting for quite a while, Greg, and I really appreciate your time. I do want to I think the listeners would be very eager to hear some practical recommendations from yourself. So I'd love to just talk about some of those, because I think we did a great job of establishing what volume is, why it's important, why some of the claims against kind of more being better aren't very well held, what some of the kind of potential downsides are of the data and how we can't be fully confident in them. But some practical recommendations I think would be really valuable to listeners, Greg. So I'd love to cover some of those.
Yeah. So one of the things we didn't cover is big caveat over all of this stuff is speaking in terms of averages. And on average, it does seem like more volume often is better. But two things about that. One, we truly don't have that much data with volumes exceeding 25 sets per week. So of the very sparse data we do have, it currently appears that volumes even higher than that also tend to lead to more growth. But yeah, there's a very small handful of papers. So I think we can be pretty confident that volumes up to like 20, 25 sets a week tend to be better on average, but are 30 sets truly better than 20? Are 40 sets truly better than 30? Currently, it looks like yes, but again, without that much data. So do I have a high degree of confidence that it's that much better? Yeah, not really. But as an empiricist, I will withhold judgment until we have more data. So that's one thing. The other thing is, science primarily deals with averages. And on average, it looks like higher volumes tend to be better. But in the handful of studies we have that it at least shed like a little bit of light into potential variability in terms of how well people respond to volume, there's some indication that higher volumes maybe don't lead to that much better of outcomes for some people. And ultimately, we would need more research. We need research with like slightly different designs to actually quantify, is that the case? And if so, to quantify the degree of like quote unquote volume responsiveness. But I do think it's plausible that that volume responsiveness varies between people, and on average, higher volumes are better. But for some people, their optimal training volumes very well could be quite a bit lower. And I think that is an important note to make, and that dovetails with practical recommendations, which is, as it relates to volume, I think we're basically dealing with like an iterative process, where I think if you're someone who has trained with pretty low volumes for your entire training career, and you're someone who cares about like optimizing your training, maximizing progress. Like if that doesn't matter to you, like if you're someone who's just like, I'm happy with the results I'm getting. Like I'm not trying to be a competitive bodybuilder. I'm not trying to absolutely maximize hypertrophy. Like, I just want to look kind of swole and like also not have training take over my life. And therefore I train with lower volumes. Totally chill. And I would not tell you to change a goddamn thing. But if you're someone who is like trying to maximize your results and you haven't experimented with higher volume training, I think it's worth giving it a shot. I think there's a pretty decent chance that it will be productive for you. But I also think it's worth keeping the purpose in mind. The purpose is not to train with higher volumes. The purpose is to grow more. And so yeah, don't just say like, oh, I need to train with like X level of volume because the research suggests on average that's what leads to the best results. Don't be an idiot. Like keep a training journal. I would recommend ramping things up gradually and looking at performance, and also, you know, if it does lead to like a notable bump in your rate of growth, it might even like show up in the mirror or on the tape measure. But yeah, you know, bump your volume up maybe like 25%, something like that. Give that a solid 12 to 16 weeks. Like if you're reasonably advanced, like it's gonna take a while. Like if some approach to training is like modestly better or modestly worse, you're not gonna fucking know in a month. Like it's gonna take a while. So, you know, give it about 3 or 4 months or so and see like, okay, compared to what I was observing previously, did this bump in volume actually lead to faster gains in performance of the lifts that I regularly do in my training? Again, if it makes like a notable enough difference, you might see it in like progress pics, or you might see it in the mirror. You might see it, you know, taking measurements of like thigh circumference, arm circumference, whatever. But basically see like, hey, is this actually leading to differences in outcomes? And if a little bump in volume does seem to be productive and you're enjoying it, yeah, maybe try giving it another bump, you know, and basically just use that iterative process to see what works out for you. Another approach, and like this, I will admit 100%, this is just the bro in me. I'm a big fan of body part specialization cycles, and I think that they're like a reasonably low risk way to test whether you're someone who responds pretty well to higher volumes. Because, you know, instead of ramping everything up all at once, where, you know, eh, it could just make your workouts way longer. Like it may not be feasible for that reason. You might like there will be probably a period of 2, 3, 4 weeks where you have to like adjust to the new recovery demands of higher global volumes if you're ramping everything up at once. But with body part specialization cycles, like you can just keep things easy breezy, just doing the shit you're used to for most of your body parts, and then just like, yeah, double your volume for like 2 muscle groups. And yeah, it's not going to disrupt your normal training all that much. And it's also going to be a lot easier to just kind of like mentally focus on like, hey, these are the body parts I'm specializing on right now. So let's really get after it on these sets. So you don't have to worry about like maybe kind of like psychologically sandbagging a little bit because you know you have a lot more just overall sets coming up. And so I think that's a good way to test whether you do respond well to ramping up your training volume. And you know, if a body part specialization cycle does shit for you, yeah, you're probably a person for whom higher volumes aren't all that productive. But I think that if you're someone for whom higher volumes are productive, it will let you ascertain that a bit more confidently in a bit shorter of a period of time. And from there, you're just kind of back to the iterative process of being like, okay, this is something that seems to be productive. So yeah, let's try it with some other muscle groups, see if the effect generalizes. And then if it does, you're back to that process of just kind of like titrating general volume to see what works best for you. And yeah, that's my practical advice.
Nice. Yeah, I think I should have mentioned it before, but if people want a deep dive, definitely go and visit the article, read it. You'll probably want to read it a couple of times. If you've listened to this, read that article a couple of times, you'll get a really good understanding of things. It's a fantastic article, and I've really enjoyed this chat. But one of the things I just wanted to touch on, some of the things you mentioned there, one of the things I think people get a bit misconstrued is they kind of mix up like achieving efficient results with maximal results. I think a lot of the time when people are reporting some of the data from the science and thinking about volume and trying to push that, they're talking about people wanting to maximize results. Whereas, like you just said, if you're growing and you're happy with the results you're seeing and you're enjoying the process, don't change anything. If you'd like to see more results, you feel like you're recovering well, you could iterate, add a little bit over time. Like you said, 20-25% volume increase, see if you're recovering from that over multiple weeks, then assess the process. Have I grown via circumference measurements? Do I look better in the mirror? Am I seeing performance improve at a faster rate than it was previously? And if you are and you're enjoying that, like, that's awesome. And that's kind of what I get to with my clients, because often people come to a coach because they want to see more results. So often I'm trying to be like, everything outside of the gym, I want to be as recovery focused as possible, so maximizing the sleep, nutrition, get in a great place so they can recover from as much as possible, but then start from a quality place. And I think this is something we obviously spoke about, is don't let your addition of quantity sacrifice quality. Otherwise you're just kind of trading one for the other, and that's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for a greater total stimulus, not just trading intensity for volume. We're trying to get more overall. So Greg, this has been a fantastic discussion. Like I said, I think we could have spoken for hours upon hours upon hours about this subject, but I've really enjoyed this kind of deep dive into volume. And this article was, the fact it's free on there, like you said, it's basically a book. The amount of hours it must have taken you to put it all together and word it in such a great way must have been a lot of work. So I appreciate you and all the great work that you do, Greg. If people want to read the article, obviously I'll have it linked below, but if people want to keep up to date with you, all the work you're doing, where should they be heading if they aren't already aware? And is there any projects that you're working on people should know about, anything like that?
Yeah, not really. I don't know. If
You're always
if you
working on something.
if you want to keep up with me, best place, honestly, is probably the Stronger by Science subreddit. I have social media accounts. Am I on social media? That's debatable. When we publish an article, I'll keep half an eye on the chatter for 3 or 4 days, and then I'm fucking gone. I check my shit maybe like once every other week. But I am pretty active on the Stronger by Science subreddit. And yeah, if I write something, it will either be published on Stronger by Science or Macro Factor, which there is what I believe to be some relatively cool stuff coming up on Macro Factor. We had so haven't talked about this at all. Macro Factor, I'm a co-owner of a nutrition app. We had a transformation challenge this New Year's period, and from that we got a lot of very yummy data, and I've been working through that, and yeah, gonna have some interesting things to publish from that data set pretty soon, I think. Otherwise, I mean, the next big thing coming up that I know of is Macro Factor is launching a training app, but that's Q1 2026. Like, don't hold your breath, because you'd be holding your breath for 6 months, and humans can't do that. You would die. So yeah, I really don't think I have that much exciting coming up for like the next 6 months or so. Which I'm very bad at self-promotion, but that's what you're gonna get from me.
No, that, I mean, first of all, I'm jealous that you're not on social media much, because whilst I do enjoy it, I think I'd enjoy also not being on it as much as I am, but it's kind of a necessary evil in some respects. But if people want to keep up to date with you, then I'll link the subreddit, which is great. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners already in there, and a lot of listeners probably already using the Macro Factor app, and exciting news on the training app, and also all the data that you got from your transformation challenge. I saw some of the transformations you guys posted over on social media, and they were just
incredible. So many. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for us to dig into that together at some point, but I won't hold you to it. I'll make sure that's all linked again with the article there, guys. Do check it out. Thank you again, Greg, for your time, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. It was truly an honor, and I had a great time.